Thank you so much for having me. I won't be juggling today, and I haven't for a while, so I don't know. It's a good thing I'm not asked to juggle. So I've prepared some speaking notes because I didn't want to miss out anything or ramble. So I'm going to introduce myself in my language as best as I can. Hani le siye Katłįà, Dene klicho satsoitine, goji seyati gotson sombake denende gojijo, Vancouver Island, Mama Cho, Alice Lafferty, Baba Cho, Edward Lessard. So what I just said is that I was raised by my grandparents, Edward Lessard and Alice Lafferty. I'm a Dene person from Yellowknife, but live on Vancouver Island. What I wanted to say was, in my language, was, but I couldn't, is because it was one of those things that was taken away from me and my family, is that after being in foster homes for a time, my grandparents saved me and my sister from the system. 7 years ago, I decided to get sober, and I owe a lot to my sobriety. It's the only reason I'm standing here today. Since making the decision to quit drinking, I earned my law degree and wrote 5 books. After articling as a lawyer, for a time, I decided I did not want to practice law after all. And I used to make fun of people who would do that, and now I understand why. I'm most happy spending time with my family. I'm a mother and a proud grandmother of 2 little boys. I'm very sleep deprived because they've had a fever. They've been up for the past few nights, and I've been helping their mom, so please bear with me. I'm Dene and French on my grandmother's side and Korean American on my grandfather's side. I work as a manager, as mentioned, at the Relaw program, and I love my job. It's working in story, and it couldn't be any better. This is a quote from Elder Francois Paulette, who is one of the founding members of the Indian Brotherhood, which eventually formed the Assembly of First Nations in one way or another. I had the opportunity to interview Francois a few years ago when writing a piece on climate change for the Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, and he does not mince his words. Reconciliation is still very much out of reach at this time. And I'm very thankful to Action Canada for sending me here to Yellowknife to be with my family and to speak today and honor the work and memory of Sarah Robinson, so thank you. Okay, so this land that we are standing on, Yellowknife's Dene territory, has been cared for and protected and defended by the Dene people for countless generations, long before treaties were signed and long before Canada became a country. The Yellowknife's Dene, who I am a member of, and 2 other nations, Dene and Lutzoke is in the house, are all signatories to Treaty 8, signed in 1900. We were under the umbrella of the Akaicho negotiations, named after a prominent chief, Akaicho, a great Dene Sulene leader from the late 1700s. Akaicho means Bigfoot, and he was named this because of his tall stature. But it wasn't just his height that made him a legend, it was his leadership. Akaicho led Sir John Franklin and his men on their famously read about Arctic expedition, the Rubicon Terror. Yet to this day, the main street of Yellowknife is still named after Sir John Franklin, not Akaicho, even after attempts to change it. So if the city of Yellowknife is in the house today, there's a note for you. Okay. Oh, and that's my grandson. I always say he was born with a drum in his hand, and he's very proud. When the drummers are taking a break, he's still standing there drumming. And sometimes he'll just sit in the living room and drum and then stop and point up to the sky. And I think he sees something that we can't see. I'm going to talk a little bit about Akaicho negotiations. So I was a manager for the Akaicho file before I went to law school, so I have a little bit of inside knowledge, and I realize that I can't share all of the confidentiality around the ins and outs of negotiation, but I can share a little bit. So the Akaicho negotiations have been going on now for over 25 years with no end in sight. The land that has been asserted is 62,000 square kilometers. While it's true that negotiations of this scale involving hundreds of millions of dollars often take time, there's more at play than just government bureaucracy and a revolving electoral system. Modern-day treaty negotiation processes across Canada are stalling under the weight of changing governments, shifting mandates, and rigid top-down directives from government officials who come to the table with strict talking points, not open minds. Government negotiators are instructed to never go beyond certain numbers, and while Canada claims to be moving towards reconciliation, there's still very little movement when it comes to including Aboriginal title into modern-day treaty agreements, otherwise known as self-government agreements. One of the major sticking points at most modern treaty negotiation tables is the bargain for surface and subsurface land rights. The federal government strikes a hard bargain. Either accept less surface land per square kilometre with the equivalent amount of subsurface rights included, or accept more surface land per square kilometre and no subsurface rights at all. So surface rights means what's on the top of the soil belongs to the nation, but it also means that the nation can't so much as put a shovel in the ground if they do not have the subsurface rights. That's not reconciliation, it's a rigged game. And it's a game that Indigenous nations shouldn't have to play with the Crown. At the heart of this is something deeper, though, a fundamental difference in how we see the land contrary to the colonial viewpoint. For many Indigenous people, the land is sacred, it's life. It's not something to be divided up, sold off, or negotiated. Land is our creator. For Canada, the land is a commodity, something to be managed, taxed, extracted. That difference in worldview has not changed since it caused conflict more than a century ago, when the original treaties were signed across the country. Empty promises of rights and title back then are now being repackaged with a high price tag today and a new name, but the rules are no different. Even with precedent-setting legal victories around Aboriginal rights and title, like Calder, Sparrow, Delgamuck, Chilcotin, which I'm sure you know of, the burden still rests on nations to prove what we already know, that we are inherent rights holders and caretakers and always have been. If Aboriginal title is not included in our modern-day treaty agreements, then true sovereignty cannot be achieved, and reconciliation is just another trending term like empty land acknowledgements. So, true sovereignty means land back. It means the government cannot infringe on Indigenous lands, not under public health policies, not through conservation orders, not even under the Emergency Act for things like war. What's the point of negotiating modern treaties at all if we don't get the final say over what happens on our land? What's the point of negotiating if we can't govern ourselves and those living on our lands accordingly? The government is still patriarchal towards Indigenous peoples because they don't think that we are able to govern ourselves and implement our own laws. Our ancestors, our leaders, fought and died for our rights. They didn't sacrifice their lives so that we could accept an offer just for the sake of making a deal and continue to be under the government's thumb accepting handouts. The land is not for sale. It wasn't accepted then, and it won't be accepted now. But the government still believes that it is, selling out to industries that are destroying our lands. Which segues into my next slide. So I first took a personal interest in environmental issues while I was completing my Bachelor of Arts in Justice at Royal Roads University back in 2011. For my undergraduate thesis, I focused on toxic torts, legal cases involving environmental harm to marginalized people and their communities. My motivation was deeply personal. The catalyst was the giant mine. How many of you not from here have heard of the giant mine since you've entered into Yellowknife? Wow. Okay, so you're gonna learn today. So the giant mine is a gold mine that left behind an enormous environmental disaster in the Yellowknife's Dene backyard and the surrounding town. From the 1940s to the 1990s, without proper regulations in place, inorganic arsenic trioxide was emitted from the smokestacks, falling onto the land and water. Arsenic trioxide never breaks down. It will always be a hazard. And now the mine is an abandoned scar on the land, a wound that can never heal, and it's only a 5-minute drive away from the center of Yellowknife. After I finished my law degree, I returned home and was voted in as council member for my First Nation. One of the first things that we did as a collective leadership was demand compensation for the contamination of our lands. Years later, the federal government finally agreed to negotiate a settlement, but no amount of money can restore what's been destroyed. The site is one of the worst mining catastrophes in the world. It finally closed shortly after a strike ended in a tragic intentional bombing underground, killing 9 replacement workers. The mine had been struggling to stay open, with gold prices dropping and pressure building, but the lingering disaster wasn't just the human loss or economic struggle, it was the ongoing environmental nightmare. Over 238,000 tons of arsenic trioxide dust and 13.5 million tons of contaminated tailings were left behind. Scientists and engineers from around the world are still trying to figure out how to contain the poison safely for the long term. Until a better solution is found to contain the poison, it's in underground freezing chambers. These are the siphons. They're used to prevent the arsenic from getting into the Great Slave Lake. And the Great Slave is one of the biggest lakes in the world, which leads out directly into the Arctic Ocean. So the concern is that the arsenic could leach out and eventually flow into the ocean. And if it does, it is enough to kill the world twice over. It's not exaggerating. Just one drop is enough to kill a man. So with permafrost melting at unprecedented rates and forest fires raging more frequently and more intensely in the north, we're on borrowed time. Climate models show that by 2080, at least one of the frozen chambers holding the arsenic will likely fail and will have to be buffered. And it's that end one there. Okay. So the giant mine covers roughly 900 hectares. This was once pristine land, the place where the Yellowknife's Dene hunted moose and picked blueberries, and it's now a toxic wasteland. When the mine first started polluting the air and water, the Yellowknife's Dene continued to drink straight from the lake and rivers around the site without knowing the dangers. Subtle warnings were issued not to drink the water, but they were only printed in English. Most of the Yellowknives at that time didn't speak or read English at all. The Yellowknife's Dene were forced to have to buy water instead of drinking it straight from the lake for free over time. Not warning the Yellowknife's Dene about the dangers was an unforgivable failure of communication on the part of industry and government. Even the man who our local hospital is named after, Stanton, knew the dangers, yet swept them under the rug. One of the most heartbreaking incidents happened when 2 Dene children died after drinking melted snow collected near the shoreline of their homes. They had unknowingly ingested arsenic. The mine paid the families a mere $700 per child. Meanwhile, a wealthy white family up the road lost cattle to arsenic poisoning and received over $20,000 in compensation from the mine. And I don't have to ask you what a life is worth what a Dene person's life is worth. There is a rumor that the streets of Delo, a community shoved into the corner of Yellowknife like many reserves across Canada, were paved using mine tailings. Given that the mine's main smokestack was named after our chief Katłįà, I wouldn't be surprised if the rumor is true. When the Yellowknives asked that the government fund studies to determine our community's exposure to arsenic, the government refused. So the Yellowknives took matters into their own hands. In the late 1970s, the Indian Brotherhood conducted its own study and found that 90% of Dene living near the mine had dangerously high levels of inorganic arsenic in their hair samples, my mother included, and yet the mine kept operating. More recently, a health monitoring program is underway for people living in Delo, Dene, and Yellowknife, where researchers are collecting saliva and toenail samples, which are analyzed in a lab. It is shown that arsenic is indeed in people's bloodstreams. But here's the problem with arsenic. It leaves your system quickly. It is a soft metal. It's detectable only for a few days, making it incredibly difficult to assess long-term exposure to prove lasting harm to try to make a claim for a toxic tort. And yet we live with that harm every day. We live with the anxiety, the sickness, and the destruction of the land we've relied on for generations. That's when I realized that this crusade I'm on is not just about environmental contamination, it's about environmental racism and the deliberate neglect and disregard for Indigenous life, land, and well-being. On a tour of Giant Mine, I met with representatives from Indigenous Services Canada at their new office downtown, the Gallery building, just across from the movie theater. I remember when that building was first completed, it was around the same time that the Giant Mine headframe was torn down. That headframe had been home to thousands of ravens, and when it fell, the birds followed the culprits who destroyed their home. Hundreds of the ravens took up residence on the new government building. The windows and ledges were covered in white bird feces, so thick were the birds that the building itself was barely visible. It made local front page news. Contractors were eventually hired to install spikes to keep the birds away. The ravens knew what had happened to their home and had come for justice. In our Dene stories, Raven is the all-seeing eye. We honor animals in our stories because they bring messages and teachings. So back at the mine site tour, I had to sign a waiver. It stated that arsenic trioxide dust could be stirred up by the wind, posing a deadly hazard. We drove around the site on the old highway, and I remember driving down that road with my papa as a child. I would have to hold my breath as we passed the mine because the air smelled like rotten eggs. Nothing about the site is natural. The landscape is barren, full of pits and rusted metal. The tailings pond has been covered with dirt. This is one of them on the left there. And they have machines with robotic arms like this one to have to spray down the dirt with a blue powder to keep the arsenic dust from blowing in the wind and drifting into our communities. And then the ponds are divided by thin man-made dams. This one on the side here is a deadly mix of iron and arsenic. Okay, so our ancient Dene stories tell us that giants once roamed the land. They went into the rocks, they went into the earth, and one day they will return again. I believe that that time has come. When the rock was split open in pursuit of gold and wealth, it woke something, a force too large to ever be destroyed. Now we have no choice but to try and contain it, because if it escapes, the consequences are dire. The second law of thermodynamics is entropy, which means that anything contained will always find a way to escape. An isolated system can only increase over time. There's a story from the Book of Dene, a collection of ancient stories as told by Dene elders in the 1700s who would have been alive in the 1600s, who would have heard their story from their elders who were alive in the 1500s, and so on, before colonial interruption. The story I'm referring to is called The Women of Metals. Some of our people do not even know this story, and it is a privilege today to hear it. So I'll only share a summary of it. A long time ago, a woman was taken by a group of men to the far side of a great lake. There, she was held captive, but she escaped eventually. As she journeyed back to her people, the Yellowknife's Dene, she came across veins of metal, copper, silver, and gold in the earth. These mineral deposits dotted the land where giants once lived. She shared this discovery, but people did not respect her for it. They violated her, ravaged her, left her for dead. But she didn't die. Wounded and forgotten, she sank into the earth. First her feet, then her torso, her shoulders, her neck, her lungs, and her heart, until she became one with metal. She is still there. Her body, her metal, is not to be taken without permission. If you come with respect and consent and an offering in exchange for metal, she might grant it and offer it as a gift in return. But if she is exploited, there will be consequences. There is also another story that is similar to this from a different region. And so anyway, the Women of Metals has not been respected. While in operation, Giant Mine produced 7.6 million ounces of gold. Adjusted to today's dollar, it made $4.35 billion, and it will cost the same amount to clean it up. Breaking even. The deconstruction of the roaster alone, a single facility, cost $27 million. The hazardous job of dismantling it in hazmat suits cost $50 million. Just a few days after my tour, where the government promised that everything was under control, I picked up the local newspaper, and the front page headline read, "Tailings Pond Spill at Giant Mine. The same waters that provide our drinking water directly downstream of the pond compromised again." Our elders always told us to not trust the government at face value. Even when they look you in the eye and say it's safe, they cannot promise you that it is, because they truly do not know. They believe they can bury this danger, lock it away forever, but the sleeping giant will one day awaken. It's only a matter of time. Maybe the giants in our ancient stories are analogous to industry, the giant machines, giant corporations, giant greed. This brings me to another example of waking sleeping giants and environmental injustice in NWT's history, Port Radium. In the 1940s, aside from the gold rush, the North saw a boom in military-driven exploration. The now abandoned ghost town of Port Radium was built for one reason: to mine uranium for the atomic bomb to be dropped on Japan in World War II. Dene men in the Sawtooth region, just a few hundred kilometers north of here, were hired to work in uranium mines around the Great Bear Lake to ore radium, but were not told why. How many of you have seen Oppenheimer, the movie? Okay. So it never once mentions where the uranium came from, right? The only hint is a brief shot of marbles dropping into a jar. But it doesn't say that it was our lands and our sacrifices that made that destruction possible. During the lifespan of the Echo Bay and El Dorado mines in Port Radium, 13.7 million pounds of uranium was taken from the land. The Dene men worked long, hard hours, 12-hour days for $5 a day. They were never told that their labor would help build the deadliest weapon in human history. They had no idea what was at stake or what the uranium would be used for. They hauled highly radioactive uranium in cloth sacks with no protective equipment provided and no health warnings. The government knew the dangers, but still sent our people into the trenches, exposing them to radioactive dust day after day. Most of the men died of cancer at a very young age because of it. The community of Dene, where the men were from, became known as the Village of Widows. We have a very, very respected, well-known prophet in the Sawtooth, Prophet Katłįà, born in 1857, a Katłįà man who made his home in the Sawtooth, who envisioned the bomb dropping long before it took place. After passing through the area prior to Port Radium being established, Katłįà had envisioned people with white skin living in houses in that area. He saw boats transporting freight. He used his medicine power to travel with them to where they were taking the freight, and he saw that the ore was being shipped to a refinery in the south where it was being made into a very powerful weapon with the intention to destroy human lives. He saw a large bird in the sky dropping something, and that bird was indicative of a plane dropping the bomb on hundreds of thousands of people that had similar features to the Dene. The first bomb killed 70,000 people. The second killed 35,000 people. In time, a delegation of Dene people made the long trip to Japan to apologize, even though it was not their fault. When World War II was declared over, the settler townspeople in Port Radium got up and left while their coffee was still hot. The injustices at Giant Mine and Port Radium are not isolated events. They are part of a pattern, an ongoing story of environmental racism that spans the globe. And because colonization has disconnected us from each other, we didn't know about these things until it was too late. Thankfully, new stringent regulations are in place so that these types of occurrences don't ever happen again, but we must be vigilant guardians and watchers of the land to make sure that the spoils of industry and government don't slip through the cracks. We have to be the watchdogs and whistleblowers because we cannot rely on government to save us. We need to draw on these lessons of the past to go forward into the future, knowing what could happen if we stand up for what's right. We must now turn to asking ourselves questions that might sound unfathomable, like what would have happened if the world would have heeded the words of Katłįà to prevent the bomb from being dropped in the first place. So this brings me to the need for Indigenous-led environmental justice movements to help divert the trajectory of global warming that we are on. Before the arrival of Europeans, the Dene didn't have permanent addresses. We followed the rhythm of the land. They moved with the season, setting up camp in different places depending on the time of the year, always mindful not to overstay, not to leave too heavy of a mark on the land, always moving in harmony with the caribou migrations. What we now call leaving a small environmental footprint, the Dene have practiced for millennia. Not only did my ancestors strive to avoid harming the land, they aimed to leave it better than they found it. And then the world changed. Dene lands were encroached on, we were forced to live in one place by the colonial government, and the Industrial Revolution launched humanity into a new era, an era of extraction, pollution, and disconnection. The majority of carbon emissions come from extractive industries worldwide. Global warming is a result of human greed and the need for control. What we call progress is not progress at all. Progress is causing us to go backwards and causing irreplaceable destruction. Globally developed nations, predominantly white, got rich off of oil, gold, diamonds, and war. But those days are coming to an end because we now know how they operate thanks to globalization, and we are standing in their way, making it difficult to do business as usual without the proper transparency mechanisms in place. Humanity must now return to indigenous ways of knowing and being that value culture, community, and creator over capital. Respecting the ecosystem is respecting life. That's the difference in worldviews between the original instructions that we were given as Indigenous peoples and the colonial regime. All too often, the doors to the rooms where decisions are being made about us, our lands, and our future generations are not opening fast enough to have our say. At global climate conferences like COP, which is happening now in Brazil, many Indigenous delegates are still just observers, not decision makers. Their voices are not being included. There is still a long way to go, but the path forward is clear. Indigenous peoples are the experts, and we now carry the burden of leading the way out of the climate crisis because our knowledge systems are in alignment with nature and have never been severed despite the historical traumas we've endured. We are resilient and powerful and are just starting to exercise our strength once again, and we are starting to do this in our modern treaty agreements. But we need to bring in the spiritual aspect of our ancient understandings, the original instructions that we were given, which hold our stories and the key. Our lands hold the healthiest ecosystems because despite all of our hardship, we have been steadfast in protecting Mother Earth, not placing emphasis on capital gain, but instead focusing on how our knowledge protects the future for generations to come. Our stories are lessons, guides, and prophecies for the future. The story of the Woman of Metals was a warning about the extractive industries that were to come. The Woman of Metals is Mother Earth. This quote by Prophet Ea is well known. He envisioned that the Great Bear Lake, or the Sawtooth in Dene would be the last freshwater lake in the world because of what we are doing to Mother Earth, and that people from every corner of the planet will flock to it just to survive. Because without fresh water, we are doomed, and are we going to stand by and allow this prophecy to come to fruition? We cannot do this work of reconciling with the Anthropocene alone. We need allies to help continue to raise our collective voices against injustice and stand our ground, learning from past wrongs as we go into this uncertain future. Reconciling with the fact that this current colonial system that we live in will crumble from the weight of its own destruction. It's just a matter of time. Greater empires have fallen, and when it does, we need to create a new path that honors Mother Earth. Only then can we say that we have come to a point where reconciliation can begin. Bringing our ancient stories and prophecies will help lift the veil that has been covering our eyes. Thank you so much for listening. Masicho.